All right. Well, thanks everyone for showing up today. I must admit, I thought I was competing against the weather, and competing against the weather at this point in the spring in Ann Arbor does not bode very well for the speaker. So thank you all for coming. So I'm really captivated by the following, what I think to be puzzle, which is why it is that as human beings we're capable of achieving really remarkable things, right? We build skyscrapers, invent vaccines that protect us from all sorts of diseases. What are some of my other favorite innovations? Heated car seats for the winter. If anyone has those, really nice when you live in Michigan. We can do remarkable things with the frontal cortices, right? The parts of our brain that one could argue make us uniquely human. But when it comes to something as trivial as a little bit of distress, anxiety, anger, you pick your favorite negative emotion, we often crumble, often spectacularly, right? We make ourselves, for lack of a better term, nuts. We make those around us not so happy. And so that to me is just a really, really interesting question. And quite frankly, it's the question I had in college that led me to major in psychology, and it's a question I've taken with me throughout my career in trying to solve. Now, I've got some bad news. I have not solved that question, but we have begun to chip away. I'm sorry, you could still leave. I won't be upset. I'm not rejection sensitive, as we talk about in professional circles. But we have begun to chip away at it. And what I thought I would do today with you is, rather than give you a broad overview of the field of emotion regulation, I thought I'd share with you some recent work in my lab that I'm really excited about. And it has to do with self-talk and the role that self-talk plays as a regulatory mechanism. By self-talk, I mean the conversations that we silently have with ourselves when we think about our lives. How do those silent conversations impact the way we think, feel, and behave? And what I'd like to do today is suggest that how you engage in self-talk matters for self-control. Okay, so let me start by telling you a little bit about how I got interested in this specific question about self-talk, because it didn't follow for me the conventional route. And what I mean by that is typically the way I get interested in new ideas is through events like this, professional events, events with the community in which I'm talking about research. I get interesting questions. I go to the lab, talk to my students. Sometimes new ideas come from reading journal articles, from interacting with colleagues. This interest in self-talk did not emerge from any of those sources. Instead, it came from this guy over here. Does anyone not know who this is? Okay, be proud, everyone. Please, this is Ann Arbor. We accept all. Okay, there's always a few. So this is LeBron James, and he is arguably, if not the best, one of the best active NBA basketball players. I used to say the best, and the talk went downhill from there because some people don't like him very much. He's really good. First ballot Hall of Famer when he retires. And about 6 years ago, he faced a really difficult decision in his career. For the first time in his career, he had become a free agent, which meant that he now could choose where to go next, what team to play for. And here's the decision he faced. Should he stay with the Cleveland Cavaliers? This is a team that really nurtured LeBron from his inception into the league. The city of Cleveland treated him like a god. They worshipped him. He did great things for them. They did great things for him. Does he stay with Cleveland, or does he move on to other possibilities, other opportunities? The ones on the table at the time were the Heat, Knicks, and the Bulls. And as a Knicks fan, I desperately hoped that he picked us, which he did not. This was a really difficult decision for him. What he chose doesn't really matter, but it was an emotional decision that he admittedly grappled with. And fortunately for us as psychologists, for any of us, I should say, who care about the human mind and how it works in an emotional context, he provided us with a window into his decision-making process in the form of a primetime special on ESPN that was called The Decision. This aired the same summer as the Summer Olympics, and I'm told had an advertising campaign that rivaled the Olympics. I want to play a very brief clip of this segment of this interview that he gave for you. It's about 10 seconds long, and what I want you to do is just listen to the words that he uses to describe his decision-making process.
One thing that I didn't want to do was make an emotional decision, and I wanted to do what was best, for LeBron James and what LeBron James is going to do to make him happy.
Anything funny going on here? Anyone any observations? What's kind of strange about this? Third person, right? The blogosphere erupted after this interview. The guy's out of his mind. He's a narcissist. He talks about himself in the third person. I thought that this was really interesting. It raised lots of questions. Questions like, does this switch from I to James, right? Just to back up a second, if we listen to the clip again, which we won't, what's really interesting about it to me is he starts out in the first person. He says, the one thing I didn't want to do is make an emotional decision. And the moment he utters that goal, I didn't want to do it, he then switches. LeBron James has got to do what is best for LeBron James. He goes from I to LeBron. So the question here is this. Does this switch from I to James represent a simple quirk of speech? Is this something that multi-gazillionaire athletes do and other celebrities? Or might it represent something more? Might it provide us with a window into a deeper psychological mechanism? What I would like to suggest is when people use their own names and other non-first-person pronouns to think about their emotional lives, when we use those parts of speech internally, not out loud, but internally, when we think about our lives, that this is not a simple quirk of speech. This is not something that narcissists necessarily do. Rather, what this represents is a basic self-control process. It's a process that can powerfully influence our ability to control our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Okay? And what I would like to do today is provide you with some evidence to support this idea. Now, before we get into some fun experiments in which we've tried to take this observation and bring it into the lab and test different ideas, I want to take a few minutes just to tell you a little bit about why my colleagues and I, going into this line of work, thought that when people use their names and other non-first-person pronouns, why that might provide them with some sense of self-control. There are really two important pieces of information here, okay, two guiding assumptions. The first is that we know from lots and lots of research that when you enhance psychological distance from the self, that can powerfully improve people's ability to exert control over their emotions. So one of the things that, if you've attended talks like this before, you might know that psychologists are really good at using jargon, right? So what does psychological distance from the self actually mean? What does this statement mean? Let me give you an example. By a show of hands, I'd like to know the following. How many of you sitting here today have experienced the following? A friend or a loved one comes to you with a problem that they're spinning over, right? They're emotional, they can't come up with a solution for how to behave, and it's, for lack of a better term, driving them crazy. And they come to you seeking advice, and when they pose the problem to you, it's relatively easy for you to coach them through that problem. You can advise them. You see the answer, and you give it to them relatively easily, without spinning. Has anyone here been that person? Has anyone here had that experience by a show of hands? High up. Okay, pretty much everyone, and this is always the response, and I'd argue that's because we're human beings, right? That this is exactly what psychological distance is. If the problem isn't happening to you, it's a lot easier for us to think objectively, reasonably, rationally about that emotional experience. And what over a decade of psychology has taught us is that there are little tricks that people can use to gain psychological distance from their own problems. And when people use these tricks, which I don't mean to use that term to trivialize what we do, but you could think about them as mental tricks. When people activate these distancing strategies, that helps people regulate their emotions more effectively. So, assumption number one, enhancing distance can improve self-control. Okay, what's assumption number two? Assumption number two is that the language that people use to refer to the self may actually influence psychological distance. So how might this work? Well, I'd argue that we typically use first-person pronouns. 99% of the time when we use first-person pronouns, I, me, my, we use those parts of speech when we think about and refer to ourselves. How am I doing right now? How am I feeling? What are my feelings like? We use non-first-person pronouns and names, again, most of the time when we think about and refer to other people. You in the back, how are you doing right now? Darwin, what are you looking at right now? Darwin's actually a student in my lab, and he was looking away. You are welcome to do so. He's also heard this talk about 30 times. Non-first-person pronouns and names, this is the language. These are the parts of speech that we use when we think about and refer to others. And the idea here is that when we use these parts of speech that are virtually exclusively used to think about others, when we use those parts of speech to think about ourselves, it should lead us to think about ourselves as though we were someone else. With one really important caveat, it should lead us to think about ourselves as another person whose inner thoughts and feelings we have privileged access to. And by what I mean by that is the following. I could think all I want about what Darwin is feeling right now, and I can't possibly know. Because contrary to many lay assumptions, psychologists cannot read minds, and so I don't know what he's actually feeling. But I do know what Ethan is feeling right now. I have access to those internal states that I'm experiencing. So thinking about myself as another whose internal thoughts and feelings I have privileged access to. So that's the logic. Those are the two assumptions guiding this work. What I want to do in the remaining time that we have together today is three things. First, I want to present to you a series of illustrative studies that test some of these ideas. And I say illustrative studies because over the past 5 or 6 years, we've run dozens of studies on this topic. And what I've done here is I've picked my favorites, kind of the all-star studies. What I'll then do is talk to you about some active efforts that are underway in my laboratory in which we're trying to build, both deepen and broaden our understanding of some of these basic processes, and then I'll end up with a few closing thoughts. So I know I was told to hold questions till the end, but before I dive into experiments, any questions, any uncertainty that I can address right now? Okay. So let's get started. Does the type of self-talk people engage in influence self-control? Our first crack at this, and my favorite study in which we've looked at this, was to bring undergraduate students at the University of Michigan into the laboratory. And what we did is we brought them in for a study in which we tried to induce stress using the most powerful tool that we had at our disposal as experimenters for inducing stress among human beings in a way that our Human Subjects Review Committee would allow us to use. And Thad Polk is actually, are you still the chair of the IRB? So Thad is the chair of the IRB. So I always have to tread carefully here. We induce stress as a caveat to see how these mechanisms work, right, in really hot emotional contexts. So ultimately we can help people, not just to be mean. Any guesses about what the most powerful way of inducing stress in the lab among humans, undergrads, is? Go ahead. Loud noise is often is used, but
Public speaking.
There you go. We can get better in public speaking. What I'm doing right now is usually the answer. So we bring people in for a study, and we tell them that today we're going to ask you to give a speech on why you're ideally qualified to land your dream job. We tell them that we want you to talk about your strengths and weaknesses, and importantly, we want you to provide real-world examples that illustrate how you've overcome your weaknesses in ways that perfectly position you to land this job. We give people, we then, after we give them those instructions, we take people down the hall into a room that really resembles it's a stark cubicle. There's no paper or pencil, there's no computer, there's nothing on the walls. It's all white. And we then just give people 5 minutes to prepare. And it's a really difficult task. This has been used in dozens and dozens of experiments over the years. It's a potent elicitor of a stress response. And so this is what we do to all of our participants. That's the way we induce stress. What we then do is we build in an experimental manipulation. And by that I mean, essentially by the flip of a coin, we randomly assign people to one of two conditions. We tell people in our first group, I'll call this the first person group, one of the things we're interested in this study is the different ways that people report preparing them psychologically prior to giving a public speech. Some people report trying to work through and understand their feelings in the first person, so that's what we'd like you to do. In other words, ask yourself, why am I feeling this way? Use the first person pronoun I as much as possible. And we've got I, big, bold, black letters on the instructions. We then give people 3 minutes to do that. In the non-first person group, the other half of the participants who are randomly assigned to this condition, they get the same basic cover story. One of the things we're interested in is how people report preparing themselves psychologically prior to giving a public speech. But then we have a slight modification. Some people report using their own name and other non-first person pronouns prior to giving a public speech. So that's what we'd like you to do. In other words, and then if I'm the subject, the instruction to me would be, ask yourself, why is Ethan feeling this way? So in one condition, it's why am I feeling this way? In the other condition, it's why is Ethan feeling this way? That's how we're manipulating this self-talk mechanism. So people take 3 minutes to think about their experience and their emotions using those different parts of speech. And when they're done, an experimenter comes back into the lab, into the room that they're seated in, and they then take the subject down the hall to another room. And when they enter the room, there's a little masking tape X on the floor. And they tell the participant, stand right there. And then seated in front of them are 2 or 3, I forget the exact number, Confederates. So these are people who are they're essentially actors. They're part of our production, part of the design to maintain stress. They're dressed very nicely. They're trained to have stoic, slightly disapproving facial expressions. If you want to get a sense of what that looks like, just scan around the room and get a good sense. You're actually a very nice crowd. But they're trained to be tough, a little bit of a snarl. And right between them, just for good measure, we at the basement of the psych department in East Hall, we have this room. Patty and Thad, has this room ever been cleaned out, the supply room for equipment? I mean, it goes back 15, 20 years. We never throw anything away. And so we were able to get a tripod with one of those old school video cameras, not an iPad pin-like camera, but rather the one where you can have a huge lens, you could see your reflection in it, essentially. And that's seated right in front of the participant blinking. As, again, just to maintain the production, which is really an important part of what we're doing. And then it's go time, and participants actually deliver their speeches. When they're done, when the study's over, we take the videos of participants' speeches, and we have judges who don't know anything about the circumstances surrounding the study, the predictions that we have, or importantly, the condition that participants are in. We have these judges rate participants' performance for how confident, nervous, and overall persuasive they were. And so this is an index of how well they did. And what we find, as you could see here on this graph, higher scores on this scale show better performance. And what we see is that participants in the non-first person group, the people who are using their name, they're rated as having delivered more persuasive speeches, which to me is a consequential finding. It's consequential because all other things being equal about participants in these two conditions, it's participants in this non-first person group, those people using their own name, they're the ones who are going to be landing the job that they're interviewing for. So it's a consequential behavioral finding. So we also do a few more things in this study. We measure a few additional things to try to see how this manipulation is impacting people across different levels of analysis. One thing we do is, after they give their speech, we ask them, how do you feel right now? How much shame and embarrassment are you experiencing? These are the principal kinds of negative emotions that are elicited from these public speaking tasks. And what we find is, consistent with our behavioral data, participants in the non-first person group are reporting that they're feeling less embarrassed based on how they just did. The final thing we do here is the following. After participants rate their emotions and complete a couple other filler questionnaires, things that we don't really care about, but we have them do anyway to throw them off the trail of what we're studying, an experimenter comes into the room that the participant is in, and he or she tells the participant, fantastic, we're almost done with the study. I've got to get a few more forms from the control room, and it'll take me about 5 minutes. I'll then come back to get you, and we'll be done with the study, and we'll get you out of here. And what we then do is we just let the participant sit in the room, and we allow them to just sit with their thoughts. Now, if you've just given a speech that has gone really badly, it's not a particularly fun thing to sit with your thoughts, right? What we're trying to do here is give participants an opportunity to ruminate, to brood over their experience. And the idea here is that if our manipulation is leading people to perform better and feel better, they should be less likely to be brooding after it's happened. And this brooding variable is a really important variable because lots and lots of studies have shown that one of the ways that stress impact not only how we feel subjectively, but also our physical health, right, our cardiovascular health, even our immune health, is because we continue to perseverate over negative experiences chronically, over and over and over again. We replay them, and we don't let them subside. And that can really exert a powerful negative toll on the body. After the 5-minute period, the experimenter comes back, and we have the subject do two things. The first thing we do is we ask them to describe the stream of thoughts that ran through your mind as you waited for us to return. We just let them describe in writing what they thought about, and we then code using quantitative techniques. We code what they thought about, and we look for ruminative thought count. Oh my God, I thought about what a complete imbecile I look like, and the person had such a disapproving face, and I really stink at public speaking, and I can't wait for this to be over. Be an example of rumination. And we also have people self-report their level of rumination during this time period. And what we see here, don't worry about negative numbers versus positive numbers. The important thing here is that the red bar is higher than the blue bar. The red bar is people in this first-person group. Why am I feeling this way? Those people are ruminating more about how they just did compared to people in this non-first-person group. So this study and a number of others that we've run provided behavioral evidence to suggest that these linguistic shifts do have implications for how people think, feel, and behave under stress. And that's an important first step, but as a psychologist, what I really care about is not just demonstrating an effect, but understanding why it happens. That is, what are these linguistic shifts doing to the way people are thinking about this stressful experience? How are they transforming it? It's presumably those kinds of transformations to how we think about stressful events that guide our subsequent thoughts, feelings, and behavior. So we did another set of studies to try to tackle into how these different manipulations are impacting the thought process. I'm going to tell you about one of my favorite ones. We did this study online using, has anyone here ever heard of mTurk? Okay, this is a technology that is really revolutionizing how psychologists do work. Essentially, it's a platform that Amazon, as in the bookseller, that Amazon hosts, which allows us to run studies with people all over the country, all over the world if you want, in the confines of their own home. We can pay them, we can compensate them, we can do lots of things. Now, we do lose a little bit of control when we have people do studies in their own home, but there are ways that we try to guard against that in what we do. So here we try to get outside of the undergraduate territory. People often critique studies with undergrads. I actually think they're very useful. Undergraduates are, after all, human beings. They experience stress. But we do care about things like generalizability. And so here's what we did, a really simple study. We ran 153 people, mean age 37, and we induced social stress by asking participants to think about a specific experience with other people that they worry about happening. And then we asked them to really home in on a specific event that actively makes them feel anxious and distressed. Anyone want to guess, just to give me a water break, What kinds of experiences came up most frequently? Any guess here? What kinds of things stress you out involving other people?
Interviewing for a job.
Interviewing for a job. And that indeed was, if not the most common, one of the most common was performance evaluations in front of other people in a work context. There was one really fun, fun is the wrong word here. I strike that from the record. Interesting experience that a few people uttered, which had to do with their mother-in-law. And here the source of anxiety was a future interaction with their mother-in-law. And this was the single most thing stressing them out. And why this experience resonated for me was I shared this with my mother-in-law over dinner one night. And I said to her, Irma, you'll never believe it. I mean, one of the participants in these studies, it all remains confidential, no names or anything like that. They were really anxious about having to interact with their mother-in-law. And she then turns to me and says, I don't believe it. She has an accent, and I'm not doing it justice. I don't believe it. Can you imagine some son-in-laws who feel that way about their mother-in-law? And then I just looked at my wife and kind of suppressed my own response. And so think about your mother-in-law, think about having to give a public speech, think about something that stresses you out. What we then do is after you recall, once you bring this event to mind that's a source of consternation, we then randomly assign you, again, by the flip of a coin, you get one of two instructions. Either write about why you're feeling the way you are in the first person, why am I feeling this way, or using your name, why is Ethan feeling this way? And we have people write here rather than think for two reasons. The first is because people are doing these studies in their home, we want to make sure they're actually doing what we ask them to do. And if you're typing, I can see when you start and when you stop and how long you do it. So I can make sure you're on task, as opposed to if I told you to just think, a participant could just be like, watching TV or doing something else, and I would never know. The other reason for having people write, though, is it provides a direct window into the actual thinking process, right? So you're experiencing these thoughts, and they're essentially being channeled through your fingers onto the screen in real time in a way that I can see and evaluate. And I'm going to show you lots of different kinds of data in the talk today. I'm going to show you brain scans and other kinds of fancier, if you will, kinds of measurements. But it's the kinds of information that we continually get from these thought scans, just having people write about their thoughts, that are always the most informative, at least to me, for illuminating what it is we're studying. So people write, and when they're done writing, we content analyze these writing statements. We code them for themes. And one of the themes we look at is how threatening people find this experience, how threatful they find it on the one hand versus how challenging they view the experience. And the idea here is that what using your name should be able to do is it should be leading you to be that inner coach, if you will. Just as we can advise our friends through difficulties and give them those pep talks, the question here is, does using your own name in a mental jujitsu-like manner get you to think about yourself as though you were someone else in ways that are encouraging in this way? So before I show you actual graphs, let me share with you a few responses that participants gave us. First, I'm going to give you a couple of responses from the first person group. So this is, why am I feeling this way when I think about my mother-in-law? I worry about giving, or something else. I worry about giving a presentation to a customer at work. I am afraid that I will come across as unprofessional, or not knowledgeable. I am nervous that they will ask questions that I will not know the answers for. I am afraid that I won't get a job if I mess up during an interview, and I always mess up in some way. I never know what to say, and I'm always incredibly nervous. I end up in a feedback loop of nervousness, causing bad interviews, causing nervousness. Even if I got a job, I think I would still be afraid of interviews. So just reading this makes me nervous, right? This is a very hot, emotional, fragmented set of cognitions, right? You could probably predict how this person is going to feel when they go on their interview right after this. So now I'm going to give you a couple of examples from the non-first person group. Again, this is using your own name. And just as a disclaimer, especially because I have the chair of the IRB sitting in the audience, the Human Subjects Review Committee at Michigan, I've changed the names in these in these examples that I'm going to give you, because people use their actual names in the data they provide us. So these are not their names. These are ones that I've just picked. They may or may not be the names of people in this audience. Thad, you need to slow down. It's a date. Everyone gets nervous. Oh, geez, why did you say that? You need to pull it back. Come on, man, pull it together. You can do this. You can do this, Patty. You can arrange this retirement party for Thad and get a good turnout, even though he is not well liked. You can come up with a speech. You can get someone else to speak well of him. You can keep the cost of the party within budget. Patty, you can do this. Patty's the chair of the department who's also seated here. You can get people to pay for the meal and drinks, and you can get them to contribute to a gift. You will make this retirement party a good memory for Thad. It's a very difficult, a very different dynamic. It's encouraging. People are giving themselves pep talks here. I always like to give people the cherry picking disclaimer here. We've got lots of data here, and there's always the temptation to just pull the best examples when we give presentations like this. This is not an instance of cherry picking. In our paper where we report these data, we report statistics on the percentage of people who got the absolute highest score on the dimension we coded for, this challenge versus threat dimension. Something like 70% of participants who got the absolute highest score on this challenge, you can do it response, were in the non-first person group. Whereas about 67 or 68%, around that number, of people who got the lowest possible score were in the first person group. So these are really having shifts. These are having an impact on the way people think. And this is just a graph that shows you that when we follow all the rules of the game, so to speak, and have coders code for these different kinds of thought content, challenge versus threat appraisals, people in the non-first person group, they're showing more of this challenge-like response, significantly more of a challenge response compared to people in the first person group. Okay, so moving on. One of the things we like to do in my lab is we first like to do studies to try to get a handle about how a basic process or mechanism works in relatively healthy people who are not experiencing significant problems of living or clinical levels of distress. And then once we have some insight into how a mechanism works in relatively healthy people, then we begin to ask questions about translation. So how might this knowledge be useful for people who are most vulnerable? I want to share with you a little bit of what we've done along these lines. One thing we've done to look at this is we went back to a bunch of our initial studies in which we ran, many of which are just like the ones I've told you. So lots of people, hundreds of participants. And what we included in many of these studies was a measure of social anxiety. It's called the Brief Fear of Negative Evaluation Scale. We had data on this on 436 people. Low scores on this measure mean you don't particularly get anxious when you think about being evaluated by others. Higher scores mean you get really anxious. And this particular scale actually has a clinical cutoff, meaning that people who have a diagnosed case of social phobia, so they are fearful, intensely so, of being evaluated by others and interacting with other people, those individuals tend to get a particular score on this measure. That doesn't mean that if you complete it after this talk and you score above the cutoff score that you have social phobia, but it means it's a significant case of social apprehension. And so what we did here is we went back to all of our initial studies. We essentially put all the data together and we asked the question, does a person's level of social anxiety influence the effectiveness of these manipulations? Maybe it's the case that as the more stressed you become about these kinds of events, maybe that's a boundary condition. Maybe these manipulations don't work for really intense cases of social anxiety. Alternatively, maybe if you're low on social anxiety and you don't get anxious at all, maybe the manipulations don't work there either because there's no emotion for them to help regulate. And so we asked this question using lots and lots of statistical techniques that I'm not going to get into because they're kind of boring to talk about, but we have to do them. A few things to note: in each study, we had people who scored really low as well as really high on social anxiety, as well as every score in between. So trait social anxiety was normally distributed in technical terms. And about 10% of our overall sample scored on the clinical range in this measure, meaning they had really intense social anxiety. No matter how we analyze the data, and we analyzed it lots of different ways, what we found in the study is that a person's score on how anxious they were made no difference for how good or bad these manipulations worked. Right? They worked equally well for people across the spectrum of social anxiety. And this is a finding that's led us to take some steps to team up with clinical colleagues to now see how these manipulations might work in a bona fide clinical context. What about the real world? We care a lot about the real world, and we've more recently been trying to take steps to see how some of these linguistic shifts might impact people's ability to cope with acute stressors as they play out in the real world. And about a little over a year ago, we had what I think of now as a unique opportunity to address this question, thanks to this little critter over here. Any guesses as to what this is? I may have just flashed the slide. It's Ebola. And for those of you, it may be a distant memory, but not too long ago, our country was intensely stressed by the prospect of a large-scale Ebola outbreak. According to one nationally representative poll, 52% of adults living in the United States had this concern, and it was a significant concern. My favorite visual illustration of this state of anxiety is this image over here. This is an image of a person who was preparing to travel on a commuter flight, I believe, on the East Coast. And what they did is they created a homemade hazmat suit to insulate themselves against Ebola. And what is remarkable about this example is I think it really captures how our emotions were guiding us to do often irrational things. Because one of the things that the press and public health officials and politicians, one of the things I think they did really well when Ebola was happening is they conveyed to society that you can't get Ebola from sneezing, right? The only way to get Ebola is through the transmission of bodily fluids. And despite the fact that that message was plastered all over the place, we still found enormous anxiety about the prospects of a large-scale outbreak. And so for us, this was an opportunity to see, might cueing people to think about their anxiety surrounding this event, right, which was affecting our country, might this nudge them to think a little bit more rationally about this event? And so what we did is we again used, let me just show you here, this is a timeline of the Ebola outbreak, and what I've done, just for interest's sake here, is I've plotted the frequency of Google searches for the term Ebola in terms involving Ebola. And I've plotted it against September all the way up to December 14. And what you see here, just to get a pulse on where the nation was, is that in late September, when the World Health Organization announced that over 2,000 people in Africa had died, virtually no one in the United States is searching for Ebola, right? It's not happening to us. We don't care. This changes dramatically when the first American with Ebola dies. Searches are going way up on Google. People are searching for Ebola, Ebola symptoms, Ebola signs, quite a bit. And the intensity of these searches continues to remain quite high when the New York City physician who rode the subways is declared to have Ebola, and as well as when the mandatory quarantines in New York and New Jersey were announced. We were able to run the study that I'm going to tell you about right when all of this was happening, on October 25th and 26th, again using this online platform. Here's what we did. We sampled a little bit over 1,000 people living across the United States. We had every state represented, mean age 36. And we did a very simple study, just like the one I told you about not too long ago. What we did is we had people focus on Ebola. We tell them recently Ebola has become a widespread concern. We're interested in learning about the different ways that people think about this event. We then give people are basic experimental manipulation. Some people report thinking about current events and their feelings surrounding it in the first person. Some people report doing it using their own name. And we then have people write about their deepest thoughts and feelings about Ebola. Why am I feeling this way about Ebola? Why is Ethan feeling this way? And we then code these responses for rational thinking. That is, can people generate fact-based reasons why they should not be worried about this disease and its threat to the United States? These are reasons that presumably everyone had access to, right? They were in their minds, and we measured that to make sure that people knew about Ebola, but that people presumably had enormous difficulty accessing, tapping into, because of the anxiety surrounding this event. Here's what we find. If you're in the third-person condition, you're significantly more likely to generate fact-based reasons. So why is Ethan feeling this way? Well, he shouldn't be feeling this way because the medical infrastructure in the States is much better than it is in Africa. And that was a fact, something we coded as fact. Or Ebola can only be transmitted via air. If you're using your name, you're significantly more likely to access those facts. Not surprisingly, if you access those facts, that leads people to experience significantly less anxiety about Ebola. We asked people at the end of the study, how anxious are you about Ebola? Not surprisingly, if you think about facts, you're less anxious. You also judge that your personal likelihood of contracting the disease is lower than if you're not thinking about these facts. And you estimate that Ebola will persist as a threat in this country for a shorter period of time. So across a range of different kinds of responses, what we find is that this simple linguistic nudge, using your name, is allowing people to get back onto this rational way of thinking about an intense public health stressor. So any questions? What I want to do next is kind of flash forward through some recent things that we've been doing in my lab to both broaden and deepen our understanding of this process. Any questions, though, at this point? So why are you focused on your deepest thoughts and feelings about this problem? What I showed you there in some cases was a dot. So not fully the entire vignette that people wrote about, because sometimes they wrote quite a bit. But the actual manipulations were identical in both conditions. The only thing that was different is I versus username, first person or not. And what's interesting from our standpoint is that how people answer those questions is transformed based on the parts of speech that they use to think about themselves. So, the question, why are you upset? I'm upset because that person cut me off on the way here and didn't apologize. I could think, concretely about that answer. Or I could say, why was I upset? Well, I didn't get much sleep last night because my kids were up, and it's really not a big deal in the grand scheme of things. What's another person cutting me off going to do to my life? So the thought process can shift in different directions, and it's really these different trajectories of thought that we're capturing here. Yeah, another question. Did I repeat the question? I think I said I would, and I didn't even do it. Okay.
Yes. Could there be a different way of thinking about when you're thinking in a first-person sense that might also lessen, say, one's social anxiety or these other situations? Isn't necessarily it's first person versus the psychological distance of seeing yourself as your personal name or someone else.
So do I have to repeat that question, or the mic has done the trick? Okay. So the question here is there, if I'm understanding you correctly, is it possible that there's another mechanism that explains these effects? And maybe it has nothing to do with distance.
No, could there be another way of thinking in first-person terms that would be
less anxiety-provoking?
Yes.
So that's an interesting question. You could imagine giving people the instruction to think positively, find the silver lining in this experience, right? Optimistically reinterpret the situation. And there is some data showing that those kinds of optimistic reframes can be useful to people. What I and others have a caveat to that is what we've seen in the research that I've done is that oftentimes it's really hard for people to engage in those optimistic reframes when they're immersed in an emotional experience. Right? It's hard to step out of the anxiety and actually do those swaps in how I'm thinking about the event. So I think it is more difficult to reframe in the first person.
Well, my question sort of follows what I think he's also asking. How do we apply this knowledge to our own lives when we're in the heat of the moment? You're not going to start calling yourself by your name and,
Well, so there's one caveat. Well, you could. Just don't do it out loud. And let me tell, and that's actually an important caveat, which is so the example I gave is of someone doing this out loud. And I give that example because it is one of the experiences that motivated this line of work. But in the way we study this and test it, it's always silently talking to yourself. It's always internal. This is something that I think, and we have some data on that, many people actually spontaneously do when they're under stress. It's something that you could do right now, and I would never know. I'd never be able to judge you for it. When you do it out loud, that's another really interesting situation. Why are our politicians, Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders, if you read the papers, they do this. Why are they doing it? I think that's an interesting question, but it's a different one from the one that we're looking at here. When you do this out loud, Ethan, hurry it up, we got 25 minutes left. This is strange. It violates all sorts of social conventions, social norms, and it's not something I would advise anyone here or anyone watching to necessarily do. Okay, any more questions? One more, and then I'll get into some of the more recent work.
Hi. So I'm a chronic procrastinator. So how can I apply this, like my situation? Because sometimes I do notice, you're just feeling tired. You can do this later. So how can you give like an example maybe how you can apply this for procrastination?
Well, no. We haven't studied this in procrastination. What I would like to know, I think it's a great question. I don't have an answer for it. What I would like to know is what kinds of emotions do you experience when you're procrastinating? And that would be the entry point for, I think, thinking about whether these kinds of processes might or might not apply. But it's that kind of question that, for us is really exciting in this program of research because, and this is a great transition to the next part of the talk, the more and more studies we do on this phenomenon, right, the more questions come up. And, how might it relate to procrastination, or the questions I'll talk to you about in a little bit. And those additional questions for us are not a sign that we're doing a bad job and that we're not answering things, but really they make it exciting because they're giving us an opportunity to learn more. So no, I can't tell you, but maybe in the future. Okay, so a few current directions. I'm going to tell you just about three. So one of the really interesting things that has come out of this line of work is that after we do our studies, we ask people, how hard, just informally, how hard was it for you to do this? Was it difficult for you to use your own name as you introspected about, giving a speech or interacting with your mother-in-law or whatever? And consistently, what participants tell us is, actually, it wasn't that hard at all. It's relatively easy for me to make this switch from I to using my own name. And I would encourage you to try this, again, silently, on your own. It's really easy for me, and others, I think, to do this. Why am I feeling this way? Why is Ethan feeling this way? Then the reason why that's potentially interesting is, one of the things we know about self-control from lots and lots of work is that self-control often isn't easy. In fact, it's actually the opposite. Often it's really hard to exert self-control. It's effortful. It takes effort to not eat the cookie when you're hungry. It's effortful to stay away from the temptations. It's hard to control our anxiety, our anger, our sadness, and we often don't succeed. And so What this got us to start thinking about is, might this linguistic shift represent a relatively effortless form of self-control? And so this is something that we've begun to explore. For us, this is really interesting from a theoretical basis, but also in a practical sense, because the easier a tool is to use, the more likely it is that I think people will use it. So to answer this question, what we've done is we've turned to the brain, this question about effortless self-control. And the brain here, I think, provides a level of analysis that is really useful for tackling this question, because one of the things we have a fairly good understanding of when it comes to the brain, there are lots of things we don't know about how the brain works, but one of the things that the past decade of research has taught us is it's told us a lot about the neural networks that support effortful cognitive processing on the one hand. So what are the constellation of brain regions that support effortful processing, really trying hard to do something or withhold from doing something? So we know what parts of the brain become active when people are exerting effort, and we also know what parts of the brain respond to the experience of intense emotion and thinking about the self, and they're different networks. So what we could do in our studies, and the idea here is we could put people in an fMRI. Has anyone, who here has had an MRI? Okay, well, we're a step towards understanding it then. So we can use MRI to try to understand how blood flows when you ask to different parts of the brain, when you ask people to do different things. And by looking at where blood, what we know is that the more active a brain region is, the more it needs blood to flow to it, okay, in a very crude sense. And so we can use imaging, shorthand for what we use fMRI for, to tell us about the different sets of brain regions that are active or less active when people do different things. And so using this approach, here's what we did. We brought people into the magnet, which is what we call it, on North Campus. And what we did is we had people recall a series of negative autobiographical events. So we had people recall a series of intense negative emotional experience that had happened to them. Every time they thought about the event, it led them to feel intensely distressed again. We made sure of that through pre-testing. And half of the time that we asked people to think about these aversive experiences, we had them reflect using I. Why did I feel this way? And the other half of the time, we had them use their own name. Why did Ethan feel this way? And then what we did is we looked at, well, how is the brain responding differently to the why am I set of instructions to the why is Ethan set of instructions? Here's what we find. What I'm going to show you here is patterns of brain activity that were elevated when people are asking, why did I feel this way, as compared to why did Ethan feel this way. And what we find are two things. Okay, first, we see increased levels of activation in a network of regions right over here on the cortical midline. I was instructed repeatedly not to veer away from this podium, which is why I'm hesitating. But this cortical midline, this represents a set of regions that reliably become activated when we think about ourself and our own mental lives, when we introspect about our emotions and our feelings. And what we see is that it's significantly more activated when people are asking, why am I feeling this way, as compared to why is Ethan feeling this way? What we also see is more activation in the right amygdala, which is a region of the brain that has been specifically linked with the experience of negative, highly negative, emotionally arousing experiences. So brain regions that respond to emotionality and thinking about the self, they're elevated when you're asking, why am I feeling this way, compared to why is Ethan feeling this way? The next thing we do is we ask, well, okay, what parts of the brain are more active when you're using your name? Is it the case that these networks, these prefrontal networks, the front part of the brain, again in crude terms, are these areas becoming significantly more activated when people are using their name to think about their emotions? Right? That's an index of effortful cognitive processing. What we find here is usually the sign of doom and gloom for neuroscientists. And by that I mean there's no red or orange or green or blue on these brain scans. There's no difference between the two conditions. Okay? There's no differences up here, which is where you would expect to see effects if using your name recruited effortful cognitive processing. So what we learned from this study is we find some preliminary evidence suggesting that when people use their name to reflect on their emotions, it's reducing emotion, but it's not doing so at an extreme cognitive cost. And that, I think, is an important finding that has some potential practical implications. I'm going to fast forward through another study here to get to something a little bit more fun. So is it an effortless form of self-control? It's one thing we've been looking at. Another thing that we've been trying to understand is when and how do people learn to do this? What we know from lots of different examples and studies that we've run is that many, many people report spontaneously referring to themselves using their own name when they experience intense emotion. Now, my question is, I've just started studying this about 4 or 5 years ago. I'm pretty sure most of these people, including LeBron James, are not attending the conferences that I talk about my research at, right? They're not reading the journals that we publish in. So where is this capacity coming from? Just to convey to you why I think this is such an important question, I want to present to you a brief clip of a 3-year-old girl named Jane. This girl is participating in the classic delay of gratification task, also known as the marshmallow test. Is anyone here familiar with the marshmallow test? Okay, so what you do in this task, for those of you who are not, this is a task that we use to index children's ability to exert self-control. You bring a kid into a room, you seat them at a desk, and in front of them you have positioned 2 treats that they desperately want. And you know they want them because you've only chosen the treats that they like. So it's not always a marshmallow. It could be a pretzel, cookie, M&Ms, your child's favorite treat. And you give them, you then, after they see the treats and their eyes visibly pop open, you then give them basically a choice. So you can either have, if you wait, I'm going to leave the room, the experimenter tells them, I'm going to leave the room. If you wait for me to come back, you can have both of these treats. That might be hard. So the other option is you can have one treat whenever you want. All you have to do is ring this bell seated right here, and you ring the bell, I'll come back and you can have one treat, but only one treat, not 2. You only get 2 if you wait until I come back. Turns out that scores on this task, so the kids who wait longer for the experimenter to return, those are the kids who end up becoming the CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. There's longitudinal work on this. And those who succumb immediately end up imprisoned. This is a gross overstatement. That doesn't actually happen. But we do know that there are longitudinal correlates to this delay of gratification ability. Kids who wait longer do better in school, do better in life, they're healthier, and so forth. What you're going to see here is this girl named Jane, and she's in this task. She's 3 years old, and what I want you to just do is watch her, and I want you to listen to her as she goes through this.
I want to eat those raisins. Is Jane gonna eat them? So, what's your Jane's gonna do? If she takes one, Jane's not gonna have all of these. She might choke. So, if you want, Sam could then eat those raisins, Jane.
Okay, so at that point, the task is over. She's eaten the raisin. So this data actually came not from my lab, but from the lab of a collaborator. And she sent me this in an email. She said, Ethan, you're not going to believe it. She's doing the thing you study. And I responded, wow, this is fantastic. But I followed that up with a question, which is, well, how did she do? Right? So how did she do on the task? So we have delayability, amount of time that kids wait to take the treats. This is plotted by age. So you see the red line veering upward? What that means is as kids age, they get better at delaying gratification. They can wait longer. although we probably all know people who are grown adults and still are in the 2.5-year-old age range. So Jane is 3 years old. This is her group. This is the mean for her group, right? This is Jane. She is well above the mean for her group. She does not look like a 3-year-old in her delayability. She looks like a 5-year-old. Now I can tell you, as the parent of a 2.5-year-old and a 5.5-year-old, I would pay enormous sums of money to get my 2.5-year-old to have the 5.5-year-old's level of self-control. Okay, this is a big difference. And of course, is it because she's using her name that she's having this boost in her delay performance? We can't possibly know. But this observation has certainly motivated us to team up with developmental colleagues who their bread and butter is doing work with kids in these kinds of tasks, to begin to see what effect does this process have in kids. We've done some of that work. Here's what we know. We know that children as young as age 4 can implement and benefit from this process. So if you bring a 4-year-old into the lab and you cue them to use their own name versus I, the kids who use their own name perform better on a range of different kinds of self-control procedures. They show enhanced executive function. They can pursue their goals for longer periods of time. But here's what we don't yet know. We don't yet know whether children implement this strategy spontaneously in their daily lives, as Jane did here. We're studying this. And if they do this, how do they learn to do this? And this, for me, is really the burning question. Where does this skill come from, right? I don't think lots of parents are explicitly teaching their children to use their own name when they're experiencing distress. Nor do I think that this is a lesson that is being taught in schools. So if it's not coming from either of those places, where is it coming from? We have some thoughts about this. If you have questions, we'd be happy to chat with you about it. We're running lots of studies to try to dig into this developmental issue right now. Directly relevant to this, we're asking, can we teach this? We've teamed up with schools, both schools that are both high SES, so schools that have kids from low-income families, as well as high-income families, so the whole socioeconomic terrain in which we've constructed interventions, learning modules to teach kids this and other self-control skills, and we're beginning to look at what consequences that have for their well-being, for their achievement, for their interpersonal relationships, for their health. And finally, we're going much broader to try to see what are the diverse effects that these linguistic nudges have on various dimensions of people's lives, looking at things like how does it impact emotionally intelligent, wise reasoning? What are the consequences of this for enhancing the way people deal with really stressful interpersonal events, such as events in which you have people from different races and ethnicities coming together, in which people are on edge about potentially offending another person based on where they come from or who they are, and so forth and so on. So let me end with 2 closing points. I will take no more than 3 minutes to do it. The first is I want to bring it back to this guy over here, LeBron James. People ask me all the time, why do you start with LeBron James? He's talking out loud. Everything you're doing is about internal cognition. My answer is I start with LeBron James because it's a true story. It's how I became interested in this topic. What people also ask about LeBron James, though, is, hey, he's a narcissist. He likes to talk about himself. And is this something that just narcissists do? I don't have data yet to answer this question, but I strongly think that this is not something that just narcissists, people who are overly self-absorbed, do. And just to leave you with a counterexample to think about with regards to this issue, I want to very quickly tell you a little story about this person over here. Most people probably know who this is, Malala Yousafzai. She's the youngest person to ever win the Nobel Peace Prize. Her story is, I think, one of the most captivating stories I've ever heard. She grows up in northwestern Pakistan, about 60 miles from the Afghan border. When she's around the age of 11 or 12, she gets into trouble with the Taliban. Why does she get into trouble? Because she believes that women have a right to be schooled and to receive an education. And she talks about this right out loud. She writes a blog for the BBC. She does radio interviews at 11 years old. The Taliban eventually get wind of this, and they say enough, and they say, if you don't stop, we're going to kill you. This is not an empty threat. They proceed to attempt to assassinate her. So a Taliban militia man boards a bus she's on with her friends, shoots 3 times, 1 bullet hits her in the face. It's really a devastating story. The positive spin on it is that she manages to survive, right? So she's treated, she makes a near full recovery, she writes this book. She goes on to give really speeches and tours all over the world in which she talks about how the power of forgiveness, despite being shot, and the importance of women's rights. And she wins the Nobel Peace Prize as a result. A couple of years ago, I gave a talk on this in an academic setting at a university. And after the talk, a student emailed me and said, have you seen the recent interview of Malawa on the Jon Stewart show? And I said, no. Can you send me the link? And they sent me the link. I want to present to you here a clip from that interview. It's about 45 seconds long. What you'll see happening here is Jon Stewart asks Malawa, essentially, what did you do, right? How did you feel? What did you think when you discovered that you were on a Taliban hit list? Just listen to what she says.
When did you realize the Taliban had made you a target?
When in 2012 I was with my father and someone came and she told us that, have you seen on Google that if you search your name and the Taliban have threatened you? And I just could not believe it. I said, no, it's not true. And even after the threat, when we saw it, I was not worried about myself that much. I was worried about my father because we thought that the Taliban are not that much cruel that they would kill a child, because I was 14 at that time. But then later on, I started thinking about that, and I used to think that the Talib would come and he would just kill me. But then I said, if he comes, what would you do, Malala? Then I would reply myself that, Malala, just take a shoe and hit him. But then I said...
So, basically, Jon Stewart then asks if he can adopt her, and the interview ends. But if you think about this clip for a second, what to me is so powerful is here you have someone thinking about arguably the most stressful experience any of us here can possibly entertain, right? Being killed. What would I do if someone came to kill me? And then, just like LeBron James, she switches to using her own name to coach herself through this potentially devastating experience. I dare you to call her a narcissist, right? I do not think this is about narcissism. I think this is a basic process that narcissists and non-narcissists alike use at times to control how they feel in emotional situations. Okay, so just to leave you, why should we care about self-talk? This is a question I ask myself. I asked myself when I first started this line of work. The answer to this question for me is we all have an internal monologue, right? Who here doesn't reflect on their lives? Okay, I would argue that we all do this. It's a fundamental feature of the human condition. We introspect. What we see in this line of work, and these studies and many others, is that remarkably small tweaks in how people engage in this internal monologue can have consequential, important effects for their ability to control themselves. Understanding why this happens and exploring it further, to me, is a really important challenge. It's one that my students and I have certainly found to be a lot of fun to pursue. All of the work I presented here today is team science. There are many players involved in this work, students, other colleagues, and it's been made possible from lots of different funding institutions. And I thank all of those people, and I also thank all of you for coming out to hear this presentation. So thank you.